Now, this is the first of two PowerPoints that will deal with what we call the Sino-Japanese War. And the Sino-Japanese War is the war between China, Sino, and Japan. And the first of these PowerPoints will look at the period 1937 to 1941. The reason for the demarcation line 1941 will become fairly obvious in a moment. Okay, first things first, let's have a look at where we're talking about. Japanese control of China. The area we're talking about will, to begin with, China had invaded Manchuria, this area up here, in 1931. They already had control of Manchuria, Nanjing being the capital of Manchuria. We are going to see that the Japanese extend their influence in during the early years of the war down through the southern coast of China. And on this map as well, you've got an illustration of the Long March, of course, 1934-35. So that shows you just those two events. Okay, first things first, why did the war break out with Japan, or why did it escalate? Well, in 1937 in July, the Japanese and the Chinese troops clashed at a place called the Marco Polo Bridge north of Beijing. It was an area where the Japanese believed that a Japanese soldier had gone missing, and that they thought that he was in a nearby town called Wanping. They wanted to go into Wanping to find the missing soldier. The garrison of Chinese soldiers in that town refused entry. Shots were fired, and the next thing you know, the whole thing escalates. China refused to make concessions to Japan, and the Japanese weren't going to back down. Excuse me. So the conflict escalates, and Japan uses this as its excuse to launch a whole-scale invasion of China. They want the resources, of course, and the land of China. This was the Sino-Japanese War, 1937. So we talk about World War II starting in 1939. The war was already underway between Japan and China. Now, an incident occurred around this time, it was actually slightly before this, in 1936, that I just want to draw your attention to. It's called the Xi'an incident. The leader of the Kuomintang, Chiang Kai-shek, he believed that China was simply too big for Japan to occupy, and that Japan would exhaust itself trying to do so. So he didn't think that actually the Japanese threat was as serious as all that. Much more serious to Chiang was the threat of the communists, the CCP. Now, many of Chiang's own followers in the Kuomintang and the GMD, they were dissatisfied with Chiang's passive approach, and they wanted to fight the Japanese. They were nationalists, of course, and they wanted China for the Chinese. They didn't like this idea of Japanese aggression. In 1936, while Chiang was visiting the town of Xi'an, or the city of Xi'an, some mutinous soldiers in his own Kuomintang, and two generals in particular, seized him and handed him over to the communists. They thought Chiang was being a traitor to China. Now, the communists had the leader of the Kuomintang, and they could easily have executed him, but they made a tactical decision not to spare his life. Zhou Enlai, one of Mao's right-hand men, he said to Chiang, "We will spare your life on the condition that your forces, the Kuomintang, agree to form a united front with the Chinese communists." They'd been pushing for this for some time, to fight the Japanese. Now, remember that the communists and the Kuomintang had aligned before 1926. They hated each other. Chiang particularly hated the communists, but the communists understood that the greater threat was actually Japan, and of course Chiang was willing to see his life spared and align with them. It was very risky for the communists, but it did relieve pressure on them, meant the Kuomintang weren't then attacking them, and it was a major propaganda victory for the communists. It seemed as if they were merciful. The Second United Front, though, this alliance between the communists and the Kuomintang, was only a marriage of convenience. It was never going to last. Okay, in 1937 in December, one of the most appalling acts of the 20th century took place. In Manchuria, that northern area of China, the city of Nanjing simply refused to surrender to the Japanese. The Japanese general, Matsui, he ordered for the city to be destroyed, razed to the ground almost. The Japanese troops responded by carrying out a month-long really, it was an orgy of murder and terror in Nanjing. Something like 300,000 Chinese were killed in 4 weeks, many of them murdered in horrible ways, being buried alive. They were slaughtered. Tens of thousands of women were raped during this period. The city was looted, it was burned. Something like a third, maybe even a half of the city was destroyed. And it became despite this, Nanjing becomes the capital of what becomes a puppet government in Japan, which we'll talk about in a moment. In fact, we'll talk about it now. Now, as the Japanese extended their control southward along the Chinese coast, as we saw earlier, they started to enlist the help of some Chinese leaders who were willing to cooperate with them, collaborate with them. One of them, the Japanese saw the communists as the main enemy, and they figured that they could then enlist the help of some of the GMD. They offered Jiang initially the position of being the national spokesman for China, but only if he abandoned his alliance with the communists. Now, Jiang hated the communists, but he was not willing to side with the Japanese. He was a nationalist, so he refused this. But in 1940, one of the senior GMD figures, Wang Jingwei, he did agree to head up the Japanese-controlled area of China, that puppet area that was sort of centered on Nanjing. He didn't really have any power, though. The Japanese controlled the economy, they controlled the military aspects of the area. Wang led this new government of China. As I say, the capital, for want of a better word, it was centered on Nanjing. Wang dies in 1944. So by 1941, by the end of 1941, Japan has control over Manchuria. Japan has control over the coastal cities of China, the important ports. And the communists and the Kuomintang are working together, but it's a very uneasy alliance. The communists are carrying out guerrilla warfare. They're fighting far more effectively than the Kuomintang army, as we'll see in the next PowerPoint. So in 1941, the reason we stop here is, of course, in December of 1941, the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor. The moment they bomb Pearl Harbor, they bring the Americans into the war, and the whole tenor of the war in the Pacific changes. We will look at that in the next PowerPoint.